Okay, welcome. We'll get underway on the stroke of 6. Welcome all to the Earthquake Society's third seminar on learning from the 3rd April 2024 magnitude 7.4 Hualien earthquake in Taiwan. Just start with some very brief housekeeping. For those that are in the room here, we're both online and in person here in Auckland today. So toilets just out the door and around the corner to the left, to your left, and in case of emergency, just follow the clearly marked exits. So pleased to introduce our 4 speakers today on this topic. First of all, a brief overview of what the Learning from Earthquakes program is. It's got a long history within the Earthquake Society of sending teams to do physical reconnaissance work in the aftermath of significant events. There's nothing quite like having boots on the ground and getting some of those real experiences, but the benefits of that work endure long after the teams have left the places where the event happened, through the context made and the follow-up. Yeah, there's certainly a lot that we can learn from going on such reconnaissance missions. Okay, so we have 4 speakers here today. Up on the slide is the team. There were 2 teams that went to Taiwan. One was a team initiated through the Royal Society, which had a bit more of a focus on retrofit. The NZSEE team was a big team, and I think Doug Mason will go into a few more details about the way that the team worked. Here in front of us, speaking today, we have Bo Yao from the Ministry of Justice, Alice Chang Richards from the University of Auckland, Gillian Benito and Doug Mason, and Richard Mole also spoke at some of the prior events. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it here today, so I understand Doug will cover his slides. As you can see on the right, the team worked very closely with a number of entities in Taiwan and helped to facilitate the reconnaissance efforts and create many contacts and many linkages, which the team will speak more to. Also really keen to acknowledge the funding support from the National Hazards Commission, Takatu Ake, formerly Earthquake Commission, and providing funding for the reconnaissance. Without their support, this exercise would not have happened. So really keen to hear more from the group. It's a very diverse group, a very diverse team across structures, infrastructure, earthquake recovery, policy, and emergency management. So very diverse team, and certainly keen to hear from Doug first. Well, thanks, Andy. Just get it. That's going to be tweeting. There we go. Okay. Right, cool. Thanks very much for coming, everyone. And thanks for everyone joining in online. My name's Doug Mason. I'm an engineering geologist in Wellington. And as Andy mentioned, we had a sort of a multidisciplinary team. So we covered building structures, geology, geotech, emergency response, emergency management, lifelines, infrastructure. So that's how we've framed this talk tonight. So I'm a geologist. I'm going to start talking about those sorts of things, and then we'll move through the rest of the team. So a little bit of an introduction to Taiwan itself, for those who may not be familiar. So it's located on the Western Pacific, and it's like New Zealand on the Ring of Fire, trying to put everything into a context for New Zealand. And also like New Zealand, it has 2 subduction zones meeting underneath the country. So as you would expect, and as you would expect anyway, given the nature of the talk, seismicity is an everyday hazard to deal with in Taiwan. It's a reasonably small country, so a small island, about the 1/3 the size of the North Island. There are about 23.5 million people living there. Mostly in the north and on the western side of the island. Because as you can see from this satellite image, it's actually a very mountainous country. So
a third of the island is lower than 1,000 meters elevation. The rest is above, because of that high seismicity, that active plate boundary running right up underneath and through the country. And so, as you'd expect, just for reference, so the plate motion is roughly 80 millimeters a year, the convergence, which is approximately double the alpine fault and about 30% more than the Hikurangi subduction margin off East Cape. So put that into some context. So as you'd expect, there are frequent earthquakes, and because of the high uplift and the mountainous terrain, and it's positioned right on the tropics, the Tropic of Cancer goes roughly through the middle of the country, there are lots of typhoons, even more, roughly 4 a year. So the earthquake that we went to reconnoiter this year occurred just off the city of Hualien on the east coast. So, and it also affected Taroko National Park just to the north. So there'll be a few themes that come through in this presentation, and one of them is the iterative learning from past events that the Taiwan as a country and all the various departments and organizations go through. So it's worth just mentioning a few significant events that have really shaped the systems and built environment that we observed while we were there, what's got them to there. So the Chi earthquake in 1999 was really a watershed moment for things like seismic codes, for emergency response, insurance. So Taiwan set up an equivalent to the Natural Hazards Commission in response or following the Chi earthquake, and emergency warning systems and different agencies got established. So because it was such a major event, a lot of buildings got destroyed, a lot of casualties, huge economic losses. Then in 2016, the Mainong earthquake, so not as seminal as the Chi earthquake, but worth mentioning, a lot of building damage and, excuse me, it was also the topic of an Earthquake Society mission that Boya led back then. And then recently, also affecting Hualien, which is useful for our structural engineering team members, because that caused a lot of damage, but also useful because it was relatively recent to compare the damage that occurred then with the damage that occurred this year and see what worked, what didn't work, and what the patterns of performance were. And this slide really just sort of drives home the message that natural hazards and earthquake hazards are a daily fact of life in Hualien. So this graph just shows the number of large magnitude earthquakes greater than 6 that have occurred near Hualien. So that's 25 earthquakes over 6 in the last 110 years. So that sort of return period really is a lot more than what we have to experienced here. So honing in a wee bit more onto the area. So it's quite similar, a lot of analogues to the west coast of the South Island. So you have the central range being uplifted, so to over 3,000 meters elevation. And then there's a narrow strip along the coast. So sorry, I should mention, this is Taipei is off to the right. So this is looking southwest. And this Hualien's on the east coast here. And there's this narrow strip that's formed from outwash of rivers, gravel, sorry, from the mountains. And because of this topography, the infrastructure is constrained. So there's only one main infrastructure corridor with the main road and rail corridors and power networks running north-south along the coast. And then there's the central cross-island highway running through Taroko Gorge, through the national park, and up and over the main range, connecting to the east and west coast. A little bit about the geology, as you might expect. The mountains are underlain by rocks, in particular, the hard, strong, metamorphic, so schist, gneiss, and marble. And in fact, the marble that along here is quite famous, and there are a lot of quarries, and so it's exported all over the world. And then along the coastal strip, it's reasonably dense alluvium, high energy rivers, because you think of all the high mountains and all the frequent storms. So it's alluvial sands and gravels and beach deposits as you get to the close to the coast. So in terms of what we actually did, we were based in Hualien for most of the time. And there we carried out inspections. But also quite importantly, we had a series of meetings with local organizations. So these were local government and non-government organizations, building owners, etc. Focusing mostly on the city, but we did then also take a trip up to the coastal mountains. We couldn't get into the national park, so a lot of what I'll talk about in terms of damage in the national park is gained from information that was provided to us and from research afterwards. And then we also had a bit of time in Taipei, where we had more meetings and workshops with government agencies and institutes, as well as some inspections of buildings that were damaged up there. So set the scene a wee bit more. Start off with the jewel in the crown of Hualien, the Taroko National Park. So this is a very famous and important tourist destination for Taiwan as a whole, and particularly for Hualien County. So there are between 3 and 4 million visitors here each year, and it's about 10 kilometers from the gorge that you see here on the left to Hualien City. So people come to Hualien to then go and do walks and hikes and etc. in the national park, and then do other things in Hualien as well, whale watching and things like that. In addition, it's also an important lifeline. Like I mentioned, there's this highway that runs through the gorge and then up and over the range. Hualien City itself, reasonably flat, low-lying on the coast. There's an active fault running through the middle of it, which me as a Wellingtonian's familiar with, but it's reasonably low-lying. So there's some uplift on the eastern side. You can see this hill in the background and then a river running around the side of it. And then the port's been reclaimed out into the Pacific on the east side. And as you can see, the mountains aren't too far away. So the earthquake itself, it occurred a little bit before 8 in the morning on the 3rd of April, and it was centered, there we go. It was centered about 20 kilometers to the southeast of the city and about 15 kilometers depth. It was a reverse mechanism, and you could see from the pattern of aftershocks and that there was quite a focus of energy northwards towards the park, the national park. So now I'll start talking about some of the ground damage. So from a geotechnical point of view, this video is a dash cam from a car driving through the gorge when the earthquake happened. And it's quite a powerful video for a few reasons. First, it's just very dramatic. So it is, hence the warning there. If it's going to be disturbing, please turn your head. It lasts about 30 seconds. The second is, hopefully we'll have sound, but if there's not, the first little bit of the video when this car's driving over the bridge is the sound of the driver getting the earthquake early warning alert on their phone. And so that's very useful for putting in context what Julian will talk about later. And the third is just what it was like in the gorge when the earthquake happened. So you can't hear that. Oh, there we go. So they hear the alert and they stop on the rockfall shelter. Okay, and then you can imagine the rest. So in terms of the ground shaking, there weren't too many instruments actually in the park itself, and you probably can't see those graphs too much detail, but suffice to say, you can tell from the spectra here that there were very high accelerations at low periods. The PGA up on the main range here was about 1.5 G horizontal, and so over 0.6 G vertical as well. And there's also very high vertical, this blue line here near the coast. And as you might expect, that resulted in a lot of landslides. So this just shows the general distribution. A reasonably focused area of landsliding kind of highlights that directivity of the ground motions from the rupture to the southeast, and really concentrated around the coastal part of the main range. In terms of the damage that it caused, well, you just saw that from the video. So the landslides all tend to be higher up on the mountains, and then they resulted in rockfall and rock avalanches. So impact damage was the main form of damage. So like I mentioned, the rock slides and rock falls from the upper parts of the hill slopes tended to be the most common type of ground damage. Maybe not so large individually, but because of the number of them and the cumulative effect of lots of them occurring along a narrow corridor, meant that the impacts were quite significant. And this is just an old quarry slope, and you can see the terracing from the benching. And interestingly, the failures that occurred were around the margins of that rather than in the cut itself. So just a bit of context about slope hazards in Taiwan and how those are managed. As I mentioned before, Taiwan has 4 typhoons a year on average, and because of the mountainous terrain and the communities that live in the mountains, hazard management's a really critical part of life. So the underlying principle here is that we can't stop landslides and debris flows from happening. So we need to mitigate the risks, and we need to manage the land use, and we need to provide alerts and warnings to people who are already in those affected areas or potentially affected areas. So the Agency of Rural Development and Soil and Water Conservation is responsible for managing that early warning system. So they have mapped out all the debris flow catchments, and the Central Weather Administration provides weather forecasts to the Soil and Water Conservation Agency. And then if it's over a certain threshold, they issue alerts to the local government, essentially the equivalent of the council, who are then responsible for evacuations and etc., providing shelter. So after the earthquake, all of these got remapped and reassessed, and new sources of debris flows or landslides were picked up, as well as the receptors. And so these got added to the system. So now for these buildings that are within this potential debris flow path, they would get issued, they would be on the register, and then when alerts were triggered, the county government would be responsible for ensuring that those were evacuated if need be. And this was tested several times because there, as I'll get to in a minute or two, there were a number of storms, and particularly a super typhoon that has occurred since the earthquake. Similar story for the highways. So the Highway Bureau manages a slope management system very similar to what Waka Kotahi NZTA does here, by rating slopes and then having a management plan for monitoring and mitigation depending on the level of hazard. And similarly, possibly more in advance of the system that we have here, this gets updated and the access gets controlled depending on the rainfall forecast. And so that gets done both by roadside warnings to warn if sections of corridor have been closed, as well as text alerts to your phone. And the Highway Bureau pointed out very proudly, and rightly so, that since they implemented the system, they've had no casualties from typhoons and weather-related hazards. This is a very wordy slide. I won't go through it too much. Just two key messages that really, two key impressions that we were left with having been to Taiwan. One around technology and the different agencies. One was constant seeking to learn and improve from past events and using technology to do the improvement part. So an example there was, you saw in that video how the car stopped in the rockfall shelter and was protected. That was a recurring theme across the gorge. There were 600 or 700 people stranded in the gorge, and a lot of them were sheltering in the tunnels and shelters. So the Highway Bureau is looking to add warning systems to the tunnels themselves so that people don't have to rely on their phones to know when an earthquake's happening to stop in the tunnel. And the second is not so much the technology itself, but the interconnectedness between the different agencies. It's no use one agency having a great advanced system if their role is to provide that information to another agency and they're not doing it. So the Highway Bureau provided the information about the numbers of people stranded on the highway to the fire agency who are responsible for the search and rescue. And so now the Highway Bureau is looking to enhance their vehicle detection technology with sensors similar to speed cameras, as well as using the car's own sensors for it's a speed control to pick up how many cars might be on the highway at any one point to give better estimates of the numbers of people who might be affected faster. So that's really the kind of key theme message that keep coming across is speed of response and how can we use technology to facilitate that. Moving now to the city in terms of what happened, there wasn't really much ground damage to speak of. So there was the whole port area itself was uplifted about just under 0.5 meter. So you can see here the old tide line. And so this has created a problem now with the whale watching boats now being too low to safely get into. So you might be able to see here, there's a couple of guys cutting down to create a step so that people can get in and onto the boats. This was some uplift, up thrust of flotation alongside a wharf structure and a bit of liquefaction in the port as well. But other than that, really, these two photos here, in terms of damage within the city, really sum it up. There was a little bit of cracking, a little bit of movement. I had to highlight here, cracking to a retaining wall, and that was really about it. I think Alice will go into a bit about the ground motions in the city. So they're a lot lower than in the mountains, but really the dense gravel, deep, so some Pleistocene cemented gravels as well, really limited the soil amplification, I think. In terms of damage to infrastructure, I won't go through the numbers, but you can see here the reduction in power outages, how quickly they got things turned back on, which just shows that the number of outages were really a reflection of the safety systems cutouts cutting in rather than actual physical damage. This photo on the right shows a burst water main. So you can see some buckling deformation to the bridge, and that's just caused some associated damage to the pipe, you might expect. But again, got things corrected pretty quickly. And the main damage to infrastructure was to the roads, as you might expect, because and the railway, because those pass through the mountains. This is just an example of similar setting to what we have a lot of in New Zealand and South Island in particular. A road at the bottom of steep, high hill slopes got taken out by debris from the earthquake. But within 3 days, a temporary bridge was able to be put back in. You can't quite see it here, but the old bridge, they just left in place. They didn't remove it when the new bridge was constructed. And so they were able to just strengthen that and widen it and use it for light vehicles straight away. And then within a couple of months later, a new temporary bridge for heavy vehicles was put in. So we visited the site at the end of May, and they're already putting in foundations for a new permanent bridge. Pragmatism, speed of response, more themes coming through. Here you might be able to see railway irons being pushed through the base of the footing here that constructing just to provide a bit of shear resistance. The number of anchors, these are light, quick, self-drilling anchors, hollow bars, just to reinforce the temporary cut. And you can see the hazard, the precarious nature of the site they're working in by the angle that dig is sitting at. The speed here was to get this built, get the foundations poured and up out of the gully before the wet season arrived. And this gully was turned into a river of mud and rocks. So to put that river of mud and rocks into a bit of a visual context, this is before the earthquake. And this is after the earthquake and after the typhoons as well. So yes, you can see all of that damage making its way down onto the road and the rail and the coast of the inland communities as well. And here's just a video to show what that looks like. So these are debris flows and debris floods coming down the rivers and crashing over the highway. So these debris flows are damaging in two ways. One, they deposit a lot of material all over the place. And you can see there, so there's the road completely covered, but they're also very erosive. So they can scour out and remove completely the road and rail. So bridges got destroyed, which had been otherwise unaffected in the earthquake. There's an example here of a couple of railway bridges that got scoured and removed. And that sets back the recovery, obviously, because that's a much bigger area that was affected just by the initial earthquake. And so really that sums up the sort of observations for infrastructure. There wasn't a huge amount to write home about in the city, but there was a lot of damage in the mountains. And so the quick response to get a limited access was effective, but dealing with these typhoons and constant setbacks and debris flows is going to take a lot longer for the highways to recover. And so on that note, spoiler, I'll pass over to Alice to start talking about the toolbox.
Yeah, Kira, my name is Alice Chan Riches. I'm an academic staff member at the University of Auckland. So my research expertise is really into functional recovery. Therefore, so I have been on several reconnaissance trips to different countries, and I have to say, going to Taiwan is a very humbling experience. So this footage is going to give you a visual context about what really happens within Hualien City. And the shaking period, plus I think across Hualien there's about 28 buildings partially collapsed or total collapse, and this is one of them. You might have seen this footage on TV1 News. Right. So in terms of the ground shaking, Doug has given you some very general overview. So this map actually really shows you where the concentration of the building damage was in Hualien. What I want to do is draw your attention to the one that is actually at the right bottom corner here. So the red dots represents the red ticked buildings, whereas yellow dots are where the yellow ticked buildings were. And you can see a lot of damage were concentrated here. And there's that one peak, 1 second, is that a peak? Just that peak above the 1 second mark in the spectral acceleration, which is well above the NZSEE is maximum considered earthquake design, and which perhaps from our point of view really helped us explain why the high-rise buildings will experience the damage we saw. But before we go into a little bit more detailed assessment of the building damage, I would like to give you an overview about the building stock, the characteristics and features of the buildings in Taiwan. Across Taiwan, there's about 8.5 million buildings, but 75% of them are predominantly in situ reinforced concrete, moment-resisting frame buildings with either masonry infills or some of the infills are lightly reinforced. So they are very heavy buildings. Plus, during the 1990s, Taiwan has experienced a construction boom. Doug mentioned about 1999 was the Chi earthquake. So a lot of buildings were built before Chi earthquake. We call them pre-Chi buildings. There was about 3 to 4 typhoons each year that affect Taiwan. Therefore, the features of those buildings have very strong facades and that creates a big mess, which means, the design of the strong facade and the concrete infills creates very heavy buildings. Those are some of the photos, the examples about the typical building, the type of buildings we have seen in Hualien. The first one was the apartment building, that was before Chi earthquake. Second one was the apartment modern building, which was built after Chichi, that has adopted new building code and standard. For the commercial areas, this is very common. We call it row buildings. So they kind of like between 1 to 3 stories in a row. That's why we call them row buildings. We also see very commonly the corner buildings present in the street of Hualien. For residential apartment buildings, when we call it apartment buildings, but often, according to their architectural requirements, they have an open space on the ground floor, which creates a soft story or weak story. So that is very typical deficiency we have seen in those buildings. And again, also, you may see those infill concrete walls from this building. And so the common presence of the masonry infill for internal partitions, but also we have seen very strong presence of the lightly reinforced concrete walls with the external partitions. In the sheer damage of those walls, you can see to this building. And a lot of debris, a large amount of debris were around those buildings from the falling tiles and also glazing, the broken windows, the glasses. That's presented a big hazard for the public around those buildings. So this is another example of a residential building that has got a soft story at the ground floor. This is the design of the drawing of this building. You can see that on the 2 sides of the building, they have double height columns. And within this building, internal walls, and also we have border columns here, but we have only 1 shear wall here. So this is the damage to the shear wall and also the damage to the double height columns we were talking about today. If the earthquake happened from another direction, the damage to this building would be completely different. So we would possibly expect a partial collapse or total collapse of this building. Another typology of building was I mentioned about the row buildings and corner buildings often present the either vertical irregularities or plan irregularities. So on the left side, you can see the McDonald building. So for this building, the damage was caused by the plan irregularity. The bar buckling was due to the large spacing of stirrups. So that caused also some, because of the plan irregularity, caused some a torsional effect on the building. On the right side is a Louisa Cafe. And this building very similar. So it's got plan irregularity that's created a high demand on those columns. And we also have observed very poor detailing of the stirrups on the plastic hinging zones that can cause all this damage. I wouldn't go through this because I really want to show some of the resilience lessons we have learned rather than just to show you the damage, because we have seen a lot of this. This slide shows you some of the pre-Chichi earthquake, the older buildings damaged were due to the poor detailing as a result of the poor construction monitoring and quality control. We also have observed the damage to non-structural components. And this is very interesting because when we actually observed the non-structural components damage, we ticked our top 5 non-structural components that's really suffered damage and perhaps leading to the uninhabitability of that building. So this corresponds to how the local engineers decide to give a yellow tag or red tag to that building. So Failure of those non-structural components were the major cause of loss of functionality of those buildings, especially in the red-ticked buildings. So when we look at their damage assessment criteria, why they gave a yellow tag was pretty much to do with the structural components, like to the structural beam, columns, and foundation. Whereas for the yellow tagged buildings, it's to do with non-structural damage, and leading to the uninhabitability of those buildings. I just want to emphasize for the yellow buildings, so you're not supposed to use those buildings, or it posing some public life safety hazard. But you can tell those buildings are structurally intact, but they cannot be used or reoccupied. And it's actually due to the presence of like egress, elevator, plus lift, and also facade, as I mentioned about a lot of cracks on the external walls, falling tiles, and broken glasses. Plus, this is more about the damage to ceilings, have all these electrical, mechanical distribution lines exposed, fell out, and that's kind of like had significant impact on the local residents and even the public. So the public themselves actually saw this imaging, they say, from their own building that had caused a huge life safety concern. NZSEE Hospital is really worth mentioning when it comes to functionality. So on this hospital site, we have several medium-rise buildings with different structural systems. You can see we have RC building, and we have in the middle is actually the BRB, and then on the right is the base isolated building. For the base isolated building, it holds emergency and critical facilities, and also proved to have the highest level of resilience, which is no surprise, isn't it? For both RC and BRB buildings, the drifts and accelerations were quite high, and that caused some damage to ceilings, partitions, plus some services. But whereas for the base isolated building, only very minor damage were observed, pretty much to water pipes and other services. And also those minor damage didn't impair any emergency response. Across the hospital systems, about 700 items, mainly non-structural components, were repaired. But the hospital itself was able to continue operations with very minimum disruptions. And we want to highlight some resilience practice we have observed. Just give you an example. So I wouldn't go through too much details, but for the left-hand side is a computer room. So the local facility manager mentioned to us that they get a quote to fix this computer room. It's going to cost about $10 million. And then so their solution is rather than just strengthen it, fix it, and they just change that location of the computer room to a lower level. And also the repair to the computer room only cost about $10,000. So it's more about, we talk about the pragmatic way of thinking about resilience. And the second one is this laboratory fire. And this is interesting was because in the laboratory, you're not supposed to use water due to the chemical, reactions response. So there's certain rule within that lab, but they still put fire sprinkler there. And the benefit of doing that was during the earthquake, there was a fire in the lab, but the sprinkler worked, and then so the fire was quickly controlled without spreading. There's another extreme case was in Donghua University, which also located in Hualien. In their laboratory, there was a big fire, and they didn't have any fire sprinkling system. So the fire spread out and caused quite significant damage to the campus. So also again, we were reminded about what is pragmatic. Do you really want to try to control the damage, and also about thinking about a better way of improve the resilience of that laboratory. Some water tanks, got damaged, but they did very quickly analysis to that. And so this is actually the solution that they proposed, so that how they actually can replace the water tanks with a very more stable structure to make sure the water tanks stay there. So, possibly pass to, I think before I pass to my colleague, I would just like to summarize the key messages we really want you guys to take away from today. Rather than just looking at the damage you can see from any other country, any other type of disaster, we want to just highlight, I think our mission is not just reporting the damage, but I think to emphasize the importance, the impact on those buildings as a result of the building damage. So for instance, the displacement of communities, providing shelters, and so the disruptions to businesses as a whole. Second one is, I think the key message we try to get across is really, our design code is heavily focused on life safety, but I think from what we have learned collectively is minimizing the disruptions should be the key consideration for the design. And also the last point is we talk a lot. That's also going to be message constantly come across from today's presentation is the practical approach to all our non-structural components is very important. So which means they still allowed some damage to non-structural components, but also those items can be quickly repaired to minimize the disruptions. And so now I hand over to my colleague, Juliet.
Thank you, Alice. My name is Julian Benito. I'm a structural engineer with WSP. Hopefully you can hear me well. I'm going to be talking about retrofitting and retrofitted buildings and the performance in the earthquake. And then I will follow up with emergency management and emergency response during the event. In terms of retrofitting, we first need to discuss about the history that has led Taiwan to this day. We talk about the Chi-Chi earthquake being a watershed event in 1999. And after that event, a lot of changes happened within the building code and the community that has led and explains some of the results we have seen in the Hualien earthquake. So the building code since Chi-Chi has been, or the equivalent to 1170.5 has been updated several times in 2005, 2011, and even recently in 2022. They have included directivity effects, basin effects. So it's pretty much very similar to New Zealand, that over the last 20 years, we have progressed with our codes quite significantly as well. During the Chi-Chi earthquake, something happened, that is 700 school buildings collapsed. Luckily, that was in the middle of the night, so no kids were in those buildings. But that triggered a very aggressive retrofit program from the government and school buildings. So there has been, since 1999 until 2 years ago, a first phase of a strengthening of buildings focused on school buildings and public buildings. And we've seen the numbers, I'll show you the numbers, and it's quite impressive. And recently, after the 2018 earthquake, and even before that, a second phase has begun focusing on the retrofitting of private buildings. The phase 2 is non-compulsory, to the difference that we have here in New Zealand, but it's gaining traction, and you'll see the results that happened in Hualien earthquake. We need to mention one government entity or organization that is called NCRE, and that's the National Center for Research on Earthquake Engineering. This center has a lot of engineers, and that's a lot of research output. And they've been providing a lot of research into how to strengthen the school buildings and the general building stock as well. So this organization was crucial to develop techniques and make strengthening affordable. As you can see here, NCRE has been developing with the school program a series of tests and prototypes and testing strengthening techniques now, like jacketing of columns or adding wing walls. And everything has been tested, even with the prototype, just to see how well they could predict the response of the existing building, but also how well did the strengthening work. They even, some schools that were going to be demolished, they even do a pushover, a light pushover of them, just to see how well they could predict their behavior. So research has been at the back of all the developments that we're going to see for the retrofit of buildings. So the execution of the retrofitting of the school buildings has been in place for 13 years and is, I believe, 99.9% complete. They have spent about 6.4 billion and more than 1,000 engineers participated. And the target of strengthening was about 100%. In total, 10,000 buildings had been strengthened as part of this program. And that's about 37% of the stock. This is after a first screening process, like the ISA that we have, but it's a little bit different there. And out of the total of buildings, they decided that only 10,000 needed strengthening, and they have completed that. So it's very impressive. The really impressive number is this, that the actually retrofitting cost is about 10% of the replacement cost. And that's very, very impressive. The way they do that is they focus more or less in the superstructure. They don't go or do much work in the foundations on the floor, as we will see with the other buildings. So they're trying to keep it affordable and practical. They do promote, at least for the schools only, the use of traditional retrofitting techniques, like using reinforced concrete jacketing or reinforced concrete wing wall or reinforced concrete shear wall. And they discourage the use of more sophisticated devices or techniques. The results of this project were seen in the earthquake. No? This is the Hualien Girls High School. It's in the middle of the CBD where most of the damage happened. And you can see that on the top right corner, we have a building that didn't get the screen to be retrofitted and suffer a lot of damage. Luckily, none of the kids suffer any injuries. And then at the bottom, there's a retrofitted building that performed really well. Both buildings are the same geometry, same place, same accelerations. One retrofitted, the other not. The retrofitted building did very well, and not only preventing damage, but preventing loss of life as well. Now we're going to move to the private building program that they have in place. And this has been in place since 2017, and it's non-compulsory, as I mentioned. But again, it began everything with research on how we can improve our building stock, what are our main deficiencies, and how can we address it. So the whole retrofit program has been divided in two plans, and the first one is to address the soft story deficiency. You've seen in the videos that, and in the previous earthquakes, most of the building collapsed due to a soft story. So the first and foremost is to repair that deficiency. And then the plan B would be, on top of the soft story deficiency, to strengthen the whole building up to 80% NBS equivalent. For this, what was really interesting to us was that there are subsidies available for retrofitting the buildings, and they are up to 85% of the engineering and construction cost, capped to 230,000 New Zealand dollars equivalent. That might not seem much, but it's a lot in Taiwan, and we've seen that many people apply to a subsidy and made retrofit possible. As I was mentioning, the first focus is the Plan A, and is the weak story retrofit. Not only in Chichi, but all the pre-Chichi buildings, they have this soft story deficiency, and they need to address it. These are the killers. So first and foremost this is the worst efficiency. Let's address it, and let's focus on that first, because we know these are the most damaging buildings for the society. So you've seen in the past earthquake, not only in the Mw7.4 earthquake, but even in 2018 in Hualien, we had 2 buildings collapse due to a soft story. In this event, 4 buildings collapsed due to a soft story mechanism. So this private building retrofit program started a couple of years ago, and they aim to strengthen 30 buildings per year or so. The budget for the subsidies is about $7.5 million New Zealand dollars per year. And so far, there are 22 cases completed and 80 approved and 100 on the way. So we visited some of these buildings while we were there. We were taken by Ingrid, and they show one of their examples is this one, for example. This building suffered some minor damage during the 2018 earthquake in Hualien, and then after that, they decided to apply to the subsidy and retrofit it. They added a couple of shear walls, as you can see here at the ground floor in the car park. And this time, during this earthquake, it suffered almost no damage. So it proved to be that a simple retrofit like this was very effective in addressing that soft story. This is another example of another building that was damaged in 2018 and then strengthened and no damage in 2024. You can see here that they added some shear walls and done some weak walls to the columns just to increase strength over height, and the shear walls is just to address the soft story. But the main message here is, and the Taiwanese did say over and over, is that they want to be affordable and efficient and pragmatic about it. And that's why in this case, for example, they didn't use piles in the foundations. They just built shallow foundations for the new walls, for example, or even for the wing walls. And that kept the cost really, really low. In this case, we see that the average cost of strengthening was $175 per square meter, which is quite low and quite impressive. This had access to a subsidy, and if you apply to the subsidy, it has to be peer reviewed by NZSEE, by the way, and usually after the peer review, they'll require you to be monitored, and this building is instrumented and monitored, and there's an app that you can access and see how your building perform, and that can inform you on occupation decisions, for example. The last one of the examples we saw that have been strengthened is the Les Champs Hotel. And this one is quite interesting because it did suffer damage in 2018 and then was strengthened using BRBs, as you see in the photos, and no damage or minor damage in this earthquake, only a little bit of pounding because it's 2 separate buildings. I don't know if you can see on the plan, one building here and the other one here. And you can see in this elevation here and here. And the strengthening was very simple: column jacketings to repair the damage that happened in the previous earthquake and to provide additional strength for the base that had BRBs, and then BRBs in each direction. No minimum foundation work, shallow foundations, and minimum diaphragm work. That keeps the costs really low. And again, it was subsidized by the NZSEE at an 85% and peer reviewed by NZSEE. It has to be peer reviewed. That's important as well to note that all these strengthening schemes get a group of professionals to review it that are independent. And so if there is an image about this earthquake, is this one, and a lesson. As you can see in the video, this video is showing the collapse of the corner building here. It's called the Uranus building, and you saw in the other video we played. And at the back, we have the Les Champs hotels that I just showed you. Both buildings were damaged in 2018. However, the owners of the Uranus building just decided to repair their building. The owner of the hotel chose to repair and strengthened, and the results can be seen. We were surprised how well the strengthened buildings performed and how minimum damage they received, really. So here the message is that strengthening does perform much better than we think. And perhaps we should have a pragmatic approach as well, just when we do that. And now I'm going to jump into the emergency response and some things that we were very impressed about. Like, for example, the use of GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, that assisted council in the recovery. This is the Hualien City Council page on GIS. And after the earthquake, they went around with a drone and collected point cloud data. So they knew how the buildings were and how the buildings that collapsed were. And then how could they use that information to plan the recovery. In this case, for example, this is one of the buildings that collapsed in a self-story, but they were analyzing with the GIS, okay, what's the distance to the nearest building, how much the cordon area has to be, whether if it collapses, what services will be lose, we can lose, etc. So the use of technology, we're really impressed when they were showing us around that so quickly after the earthquake, they had all this in place and using that information to respond. The other thing that impressed us is that all the information we gather here in New Zealand from different websites was in a single portal over there. So building consent information, whether the building was rectangular or not, geology, even borehole information, liquefaction areas, you name it, everything. So they are very democratic about information, and they share the information, and they cooperate very well in their systems, and they are quite well integrated. And I think that's something to learn about. Now, the next slide, I want you to pay attention because it's the early warning system that Doug mentioned before. And I want you to see the video that will appear and how fast the early warning system is triggered. So this is the earthquake. In the earthquake, shaking is detected. Boom, you receive an SMS message that an earthquake is happening. So usually it takes 7 seconds. And we were really impressed. We had early warning systems for every aftershock while we were there. There was a peculiar one at midnight every day. And we are quite impressed by this. So usually they detect the P waves, and with the P waves, they can see where the epicenter is located and what's the magnitude. And with that, they can then see what the intensities will be across the country and then issue the warnings accordingly as they measure that. So that was quite interesting to see. And this is the level of shaking across the country. And this is how the system was triggered on the day of the event. And you see that it was triggered mostly on Hualien and the central area, but not in Taipei, which is at the north. And there was a lot of damage in Taipei as well. And people complained because their cell phones didn't go off and there was a big earthquake. So after that, they revised the thresholds, and they changed the threshold to be activated for large magnitude earthquakes for about 6.5. So it's a system that keeps evolving and keeps learning, and it keeps improving. No? And usually the early warning system, besides getting your text message and the sound alarm in your phone, if you're watching the TV, the transmission will be interrupted, and they will say, look, there's an earthquake, drop, cover, hold. Or if you have the app from CWA, they will send you an alert to the phone as well. So we're really impressed by the use of technology while we were there. One of the main things that we were impressed about emergency management there was a particular institute from government that is called NZDR, which means the National Science and Technology Center for Disaster Reduction. And they are a science-based institution, and they put together basically all the other agencies and coordinate them so they can have a technology-based emergency response with information and the backup of science. So most of the people there are scientists or engineers, and even in government, ministers are engineers or scientists, and they use technology to make informed decisions about how to mitigate the impacts of the earthquakes. For that, it's so impressive that all the agencies that provide information for the response, so for the emergency response, they are sitting under the same building in Taipei. And they work collaboratively the whole year. And then when there is an event, they just take the elevator and go to the emergency operations center in one of the floors. And we were impressed of the level of integration they had. When we visited there, people came to the room where we were because they were all in the same building. Now we were standing in the room, and people will come from different agencies and explain what they did. Part of the emergency management also relies in a public-private cooperation model. There is not only government, that NGOs participate in the response and they know what to do and they rely on that. And we were also very surprised, very impressed by the amount of education and information that were everywhere you go. There was a track just to show you things about earthquake or disasters and how to be prepared, from booklets or everything, everywhere. People are very well educated and expected to know what to do, no? When an earthquake hits or a typhoon hits. And they have national drills every year at the GTA anniversary, which is in a couple of weeks. In terms of the emergency response, so 15 centers were activated in different counties around the country, as you can see in red here, over there. And as I mentioned, that they rely on the non-governmental organizations for the response. They had already refuge and shelters by 10:30 a.m. Just 2 hours after the earthquake, tents and refuges were put in place for any people that had to evacuate their building could go and find shelter. So that's very impressive. The urban search and rescue in Hualien was completed in the same day, but in Tauroco it took several days. As Doug mentioned, there was already about 700 people trapped in Tauroco, and that took a couple of days to help. And in total, 2,000 people were evacuated. As we saw before, State Highway 9, this is the one running parallel to the coast, reopened in 3 days. Perhaps luck, they have a second bridge where they lost one. But State Highway 8 is going to take longer, it's going to take years. Luckily, the tunnels and the protection structure acted as shelters, but even so, there was a 5-star hotel in the middle of the park that served as a shelter while they were waiting to be rescued. So not a bad place to be. In terms of the impacts, unfortunately, 18 people died from the effects of the earthquake, and 3 people are still missing. Most of the deaths were caused by rockfalls. Only 1 person died due to building damage, which is quite impressive. And that person died because she went back to her apartment to grab something, and something fell onto her. So it's not even from the collapse, it's from indirect damage. A total of 1,000 people were injured, and 90 buildings were red tagged and about 89 yellow tags. The placarding of buildings was done very quickly as well. And these are the placards that usually they put in the buildings. And you can see the extent of the damage in Hualien. And they are carried out by architects, civil engineers, structural engineers, with a mix of everything, of different professionals. But they do frequent rehearsals and training. I believe they have a mandatory training every year to do if you want to be in the group that does these assessments. We were surprised how quickly they were recovering and demolishing buildings and clearing the sites with damaged buildings. By the time we were there were already 13 of them removed and out of sight. Oh. Thank you.
I am Boya Li. I am the last speaker for this evening. So it's getting late. I will go fast through next few slides. I was born and bred in Taiwan. I lived through Chichi earthquake in 1999. I went to the area near epicenter a couple of weeks after the main shock, and that was a turning point for me in my life. Like many people in Taiwan, for people in my generation, we never thought we would see something like that. I came to New Zealand 20 years ago. When I first got here, I felt New Zealand is such a quiet country, no earthquake. I have worked in New Zealand at emergency management and also a few government departments with large property portfolios. And so for me, it's very interesting to use my what I have seen in Taiwan and what we do in New Zealand. And that was why I have this honor to take the team to Taiwan for this mission, and also in 2016. So this slide, I just want to quickly cover the impact on Hualien tourism and economy. Like Doug mentioned earlier, Hualien basically relied on tourism to Taroko National Park. When people cannot go to the national park, and also the transport routes going into Hualien often get disrupted. Like rail line has been disrupted 4 times since the earthquake. People don't go to Hualien, the economy basically is dying, and government has put in a number of measures to help that. So I will not go into the detail of that. And you can see the building, like this is a hotel building Julian talked about earlier. It wasn't damaged, but would you go there if you saw an image like this? And this, you can't quite read that Chinese, but this is the schedule for reopening the national park. So this part on the western side, less damage has been reopened. The red, they are the worst affected areas. They probably wouldn't be open for another 6 years. And some of the green areas that may be open later this year, but there has been a lot of debate about should we reopen the national park or not. Next few slides, I just want to quickly run through a summary of the key observations that you have heard from the previous speakers. 1999 Jeju earthquake, you have heard that it was a turning point for Taiwan. The main shock went on for 100 seconds. 100 days after the main shock, there's constant big aftershock. So it wasn't just one earthquake event to Taiwan. It was on and on and on and on. And that was why Taiwan had to make a lot of changes to everything you can think of. Because after you have been through that event, you just had to change everything and improve everything. And I will not go into the detail of this that you have heard quite a bit. It's a photo of the search and rescue team going into the gorge, and you could see the rockfall still happening. I don't know how they were so brave. Retrofit, you have heard quite a bit earlier. And this was the building, the hotel building Julian mentioned that was retrofitted after 2018. And this was the building that collapsed. You could see you do your best, but you cannot choose your neighbor. It was about 4-meter distance, very close. And you heard a lot, simple, pragmatic, efficient retrofit approach works. Technology, you heard a lot. When we were in Taiwan, we were very impressed by the technology application. And one of the team members asked, apart from GIS, what else do you use that we might be able to apply in New Zealand? And the answer to that question, the gentleman said, it's not just about technology. It's about integration, interagency, collaboration. And you heard quite a bit early on. And also you have heard Doug and Julian both talk about the earthquake early warning system. I'm going to play a short video to show that it's quite dramatic. If you are uncomfortable, then just shut your eyes. So the shaking started, and you can see the counting the seconds. How many people ran out of that place? And someone was trying to go into the building. Luckily, he didn't. The building collapsed. 10 seconds. About 20 people ran out of that place. There was a busy, popular breakfast place in Hualien City. And earthquake happened 7:58 in the morning. The place was really busy. The owner operator, she came out last. She even remembered to shut the gates. And so that showed that the earthquake warning system does work. And another one is that you have heard that Taiwan has so many earthquakes and typhoons all the time. For them, for Taiwanese, you have to do all this all the time. So it's not just like, something might happen one day. No, it happens all the time. So you have to do all this is like business as usual. It's not like, it's not emergency one day. It's business as usual. Just do it. And also that Doug mentioned that landslide geotech impacts, they could get worse after typhoons, and they have got worse. The impact has been way worse. And you could see like rockfall happened suddenly just in a good day, dry weather, and this is a tunnel to show that. Over 150-ton rock just came down, damaged the rail. And also, we have seen that found Chichi earthquake that the damage after the Chichi earthquake and also the severe typhoon after a couple of years after Chichi has really worse impact to the whole Taiwan. And people are there are things that you can say could happen to Taiwan or in Hualien area for next few years. This is the last slide that about why Hualien or Taiwan actually came out relatively well after this big event. We thought we have been asking ourselves and talking about why. One is that Doug mentioned earlier, Hualien has a lot of earthquakes and typhoons every year. The location is typhoon hit all the time. People in Hualien, they are very resilient. They are so familiar with this event. You get on with life, you know what to do in general. And also, like Julia mentioned, the retrofit after 2018 earthquake have helped and saved quite a few lives. Early warning system you have seen, they actually do work and have saved quite a lot of lives. And also, they are good public awareness about the system. And you heard that people complained when they didn't get the alert. Exercise do work. In Taiwan, as Junior mentioned, every year, the September is their national exercise month. And 2 years ago, Hualien was chosen as the location for national exercise. More than 1,000 emergency responders participated. So they had the drill 2 years ago that helped. And also we have heard that tunnels work. This is a tunnel in State Highway going through the park, the Gorge National Park. Many lives were saved here. Some were there or some went there waiting to be rescued. This is, so they are having the national exercise now, and this is a scenario, this is a scenario for this year's exercise, magnitude 7.3 with epicenter here. And that's why they have done their drill a couple of years ago for Hualien. Finally, there was an element of luck. The location of epicenter was off coast. When Chichi earthquake happened, it was right underneath Taiwan. So the damage was really severe, but this one's off the coast. Timing earthquake, it was early morning, and it was just before a long weekend. It was Wednesday morning. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday was a 4-day long weekend, one of the biggest festivals in Taiwan. Had the earthquake happened over the long weekend, over a little bit later in the morning, there would have been many, many, many more people inside the national park, and the casualty would have been far worse. So luck does count. And it's just photos of the different teams. And we have mentioned earlier that we were very grateful, and we had a lot of hospitality from different organizations. Taiwanese, they are very generous and happy to share the information with us. So just thank again, also thanks to National Natural Hazards Commission's funding support. That's the end. I'm going to hand over to Andy for the QA.
Thanks to our 4 speakers. So yeah, we do have a bit of time for a few questions, if there are any from the audience. I'm a bit suspicious because none seem to have come through on the webinar app, so I might try and multitask and see if I can test the host permissions on the screen. But in the meantime, any questions from the audience for our 4 speakers? Sure.
Well, sorry, something else. You talked quite a lot about the benefits they achieved through pragmatism. What would we need to change in New Zealand to achieve the same level of pragmatism?
Sounds like a policy question.
So the question was, talked a lot about pragmatism. What would we need to change in the New Zealand approach to benefit some of that pragmatism?
I can't offer an or the answer. Possibly a way to start is it's Taiwan, from what I've gathered, being there and then researching things afterwards, is it's iterative. So there wasn't the sort of program to set out to find the solution and we won't do anything until we have the solution and then we'll do it. It's what worked previously, what didn't work, how can we improve, constant improvement, reflection on things that do work well and don't work well in the context of all these hazards and happening all the time. So for New Zealand, I mean, it's different, you know, Taiwan's a lot smaller, more condensed, and so it's maybe more effective at integrating different agencies within a smaller area with smaller networks, but I think maybe not looking for the solution straight away as a start.
Nobody will correct me.
No, I'm not trying to correct. Yeah, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but
Just turn the mic off.
speaking of pragmatic retrofit, I mentioned that I had worked in a few government agencies. We have got large property portfolios. So seismic assessment and retrofits is kind of constant thing in our life and work. It's quite different how Taiwanese deal with that. You have heard about pragmatic, you know, you can just put in shore wall, wing wall to address the most critical issues. It may not be perfect answer, but they do address the most critical issues efficiently, and you will save lives and probably less building damage. But in New Zealand context, we have got the review of earthquake-prone building system going on now. So there's an opportunity to perhaps change the way we look at the building. And in New Zealand, people get very obsessed about MBS, and who does not necessarily relate to the critical part of weakness. And then when you want to retrofit the building, you have to talk with the councils whether we can just fix the critical part, or council will say, no, you can't, you have to address some other issue at the same time, foundation. And so this does require quite a bit of system change, I think. Okay.
Thanks for that. We've got another really good question from Caroline Holden. Going to take the chair's prerogative and expand on it a little bit because we're really interested in it too. Thanks for the great presentations. What message comes with the early warning, drop, cover, hold, any tsunami warnings? So we obviously saw some really great examples of its effectiveness, particularly with the tunnels. The last image of the people running out the building was especially interesting because the messaging in New Zealand, we know that we have suffered fatalities from stuff falling into streets. And so with any early warning, there needs to be an action, and what sort of messaging is coming out in Taiwan, and was there any discussion around what sort of messaging we would put to our own early warning system in light of some of the things that were sort of celebrated on the screen as being successful?
Thank you for the question. We had the same question in the previous presentation as well. The message over there was also drop, cover, hold. I think there is no message about what to do with the early warning system, except that you would assess the situation to do whatever is more convenient to you. Those people probably were there just a few steps away from the street, so they thought, let's get out instead of recovering hold in our place. No, it depends on the situation, I guess. Their message is drop, cover, hold. The message in New Zealand for now is drop, cover, hold. Anything else?
been through collapsed buildings 6 years ago, so they knew not to stay in the building.
But Doug was mentioning that, yeah, they've been through perhaps collapsed buildings from 6 years ago in Hualien in 2018, so probably they knew what to expect for those buildings as well.
Probably an issue with Doug, but you mentioned that liquefaction wasn't too much of an issue in Raffles, but was there any locations or areas or that were susceptible to liquefaction, and were they did they perhaps had previous improvements that were assessed on their performance?
Just repeat the question.
Yeah. So the question was, so I mentioned that there wasn't too much to see in terms of liquefaction in Hualien, but was that the case across the country, and what's sort of understood or mapped about liquefaction?
Remediation that were previously put in, well, or
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, there is a national liquefaction hazard map that was there was a national sort of directive after the Mw7.4 earthquake to update that with a minimum number of boreholes per kilometre to make it, robust across the country. And so there is a liquefaction hazard map for Hualien, and it's generally low, but there are some pockets of higher hazard. In terms of specific improvements that might have been made to, say, bridges or anything, I can't comment too much on that because we didn't have that information. There was some liquefaction observed on the rivers to the southwest, where they come out of the hills, just within the riverbeds themselves. But we didn't hear any reports of damage to the bridges that cross those. So whether or not they have been improved or just are robust, I mean, I did have a photo of a pylon crossing a river as we were on the train, and it's supported on this giant pile with a plinth, and then the pylon's on top of it. So they take things seriously. I suspect that's more to do with flood hazard and coming down to those rivers rather than liquefaction. I think Taipei would be more prone, but I haven't heard of any liquefaction damage in this earthquake. But yeah, it looks like she might know more.
No, just in general, the western side of Taiwan has some pockets of western side of Taiwan are more likely to have liquefaction. And so Mw7.4 earthquake in 2016, Mw7.4 is southwestern Taiwan. They did have a serious liquefaction at the time because of the area just low-lying, and also some areas were ponds before houses built on there. So generally speaking, western side is more, yeah.
Yeah, for the buildings which is constructed after the past earthquakes, the building codes are updated. What is that building is like performed well in earthquake when compared to the old building codes? Is that the update works, or is it the same damage?
So the question was, how was the performance of the buildings built after the Chichi earthquake, and with the new codes, how did it perform? They perform very well. Now the code has a provision for sub-story where you have to calculate the strength and the stiffness of each story, pretty much like we have here. So they're very aware of that. We have seen sub-stories with new buildings as well, but I think they are designing for that. They're encouraged now to use more shear walls and to continue those shear walls to the bottom of the building. So there is more, at least, regularity and redundancy in the new ones. And there was almost no damage in the new ones. I know in the previous earthquake there was a collapse on one recently built building, but not in this case.
Just to give you a sense about, we inspected about 20 buildings. So we observed 2 buildings that were built after 2000, that is post Chichi earthquake, that suffered damage, but only in 2 non-structural components.
Take one from the web. To what extent are there installed seismic monitoring systems in buildings and use of this for rapid assessments?
Yeah, correct. So the example we put in the presentations was a retrofitted building that usually those ones, if you are applying for a subsidy, get a peer review from NZSEE, and NZSEE have developed their own systems for monitoring and accelerometers and data loggers. So that building, and I assume that will be a requirement for most of the retrofitted building. How well is that extended to the rest of the country? I cannot say. I would say that with the use of technology, it's getting better and better. What we were surprised is that not only that building, but other buildings, all the data can be accessed through a web that anybody can access as well. Probably some people don't allow that to be public, but you can go to a website and access the acceleration records on those buildings. So I think it's going to get traction and it's going to get more universal as time develops. Thank you.
Did you get a sense from the conversation that you had of what learnings are taking forward out of this? And is that more focus on non-structural damage in buildings and more onus on what fall protection, or?
Yes, so certain because due to the time constraint, we couldn't give you a lot of details, but we also actually talked to building owners about, for instance, when we measure functionality or we try to think about functional recovery of that building, we actually also look at utility services. How long did it take for the localized water pipes, the broken ones that as a result of the damage from the earthquake got repaired, and also how soon they actually got water. So I think we have that quantification about functionality and also how much that can be attributed to utility services and how much is to do with quick repair to non-structural components. And also we look at, I think that is something we don't want to go too much into details, but I think for the building and ground damage, we covered a lot also about the decisions of different organizations, agencies, but also the decision-making process of the building owners when it comes to whether they're gonna actually choose what type of, for instance, repair solutions, and are they gonna go for repair or are they gonna go for rebuild? So that decision process we also have mapped out as well. Yeah, one thing we didn't touch on, I think is worth later for you to follow up with the team, is we mentioned about red tagged buildings and yellow tagged buildings, but their tagging system is very different from New Zealand. That's why we try to avoid it. Don't want to confuse you. Red tagged buildings doesn't mean we cannot enter that building. So only in the dangerous building, we call it very red or purple buildings, they got asked to do very urgent strengthening or has to be demolished. So we actually enter some red tagged buildings, we call them pink buildings. So yeah, so council still allow them, they have different pathways. For instance, you can choose to do strengthening or you can choose to do rebuild, and they have different subsidies. So so I would say when it comes to building part, it's a lot of things going on, not just looking at the damage, but also look at impacts on the communities, on people living inside, and also linking that to functionality. So not just the structural or non-structural components.
One second. I would like to go back to the previous question about the rapid building assessment with the monitoring of the buildings that I forgot to answer. They are used, those monitoring and those results from the earthquake are used for occupancy decisions on those buildings, and usually also monitor rent increase. So probably they will get a decision made based on the readings. And also we were really impressed with the GIS systems that are actually more or becoming like a digital twin. They were able to make losses estimations within a day or even in the same day of the earthquake, and they could see what amount of buildings they would expect to have collapsed, how many deaths, etc. So they can plan for the response. And I think they also mentioned, but we didn't see it, that they have systems that do dynamic analysis for the whole city as well as a digital twin, just to get how good or where the damage may be and where they need to go. Thank you.
So the maximum ground horizontal vibration is like 1.5, which is very high. And you also mentioned it's on flatter ground, the acceleration was less and the mountain is high. So this means topographic implication have been observed. And also local site effect, how much contribute to the intense shaking? Any idea about local site effect and topographic implication?
So the question for the online people was the observations of ground motions so much higher intensity in the mountains and what amplification effects might be going on there. So yeah, topographic amplification certainly, I mean, is an obvious one, and it's been observed elsewhere. And given the height and the shape of those mountains, and the number of landslides, they expect it. In terms of analysis, I'm not sure what has been assessed. The other effects, Julian, it was mentioned directivity because it was a northward directed rupture, focusing its energy towards the mountains. So again, I can't say for sure how much that contributed to the difference between the mountains and Hualien city itself, but clearly those things play a part.
1.5 peak ground acceleration observed from mountain station.
Yeah, so for that particular site, I'm not sure. It looks like it's on a ridge or high up on the mountain. So clearly, you'd expect some amplification effects there.
I'll take one more online. One from Carolyn. Were aftershock forecasts communicated to the public, emergency responders, engineers, tourists? ?
I think the answer is we don't know and we haven't seen it, but the NCRE produced like 2 or 3 reports on the same day of the earthquake. So probably the forecasts, if there been any, might have been there, but I don't remember seeing them about the possible aftershocks. There were lots of aftershocks. The amount of aftershocks was impressive, but I don't have a real answer about it. Sorry.
Prasad from WSP. I know this is probably, this is more of a policy question, but there is obviously a lot of learnings from Taiwan that we could bring, even though the context for New Zealand is a bit different. A lot of different. Are you recommending something through the Natural Hazards Commission and hopefully to NVIE to like that interdepartmental and intergovernmental collaboration? That's a start. Education for the general public, the rapid recovery. That's super impressive for a terrain like that. So the bridge to be built in 3 days. So there's a huge amount of learnings. Would you see any actions coming out of this from New Zealand? I know it's a tough question.
Well, that's the government representative to answer that.
Ken was meeting with the Prime Minister.
Our mission has been funded by the Natural Hazards Commission, and as part of that obligation, we do have to write a report to them. Let's do next week. How much influence or possibility we don't know, but so we mentioned that Andy mentioned it in the beginning that there were 2 teams. The first team was mainly funded by Royal Society New Zealand, and they had the retrofit focus. This is Ken. He's chief engineer for MB and Natural Hazards Commission, and he has given a presentation, and he has been very impressed himself by the pragmatic approach used in Taiwan. And when we gave when we did this seminar in Wellington last week, after the seminar, Ken went to Doug and asking him for a copy of the video, the tunnel video that Doug showed in the seminar, because Ken was going to meet with the minister the following day. So I think some things are being discussed, but how much impact there will be, I can't really say. But we have also we got some questions from Christchurch audience from the CDN group about they have been interested in the early warning system as well. So I think there's some discussions going on, and since there might be some changes slowly.
I think the other easy way to answer that question is that it all comes at an opportune time. In fact, the announcement of the EPB review almost perfectly coincided and was delayed a week, in fact, by the Hualien earthquake. The terms of that review have been released and are very broad. They don't just relate to a review of the regulatory settings. It's the regulatory settings in the context of the broader way in which we manage risk. And they do require the team doing the review to explicitly look at other jurisdictions and how they manage risk. And so I think you can be assured that there's a lot of people that are going to be looking at these learnings in quite some detail, and a really great effort from the team to bring some of that back. We've clicked a few minutes over time, so we'll draw the questions to a close. We could get another round of applause for our presenters today for very interesting talks.